There are moments when a life doesn't fall apart loudly. It collapses in silence. It starts with a hallway. White walls. Bright fluorescent lights that make skin look sickly. A hospital corridor, so clean it feels unreal. And a mother standing still in the middle of it, holding her phone like it has turned into something dangerous. Because on the screen is a message she never expected to see. Not from a stranger. Not from an unknown number. From her own home computer. A message that doesn't just suggest betrayal. It suggests something else entirely. Something that makes the air in her lungs feel too thin. Somewhere behind a set of double doors, her daughter lies on a hospital bed. Weak, feverish, barely responsive, while nurses move quickly around her, calling out numbers and instructions. But Denise can't focus on any of that. Because now she knows the one thing she was never supposed to find out. The one thing that turns her marriage into a crime scene. And her home into a place she can no longer recognize. The doctors have told her daughter's symptoms are serious. When you live with cerebral palsy, even a high fever can spiral. There can be complications. There can be infections that move faster than anyone anticipates. But the fever isn't the part Denise can't breathe through. It's the question that's suddenly chewing through her brain like acid. How could her disabled daughter be pregnant? She keeps seeing the word in her mind like it's been carved into metal. Pregnant. Her daughter Grace, limited mobility, dependent on help for daily routines, trusting by necessity, pregnant. And the pregnancy itself is not the most horrifying part. The horrifying part is what it implies. It implies access. It implies time. It implies privacy. It implies that someone got close enough, long enough, to do something that can't be undone. And it implies something even worse. That whoever did this didn't fear the consequences. Because they assumed Denise would never discover it. Denise stands there in the corridor, stuck between two realities. In one reality, she is a mother managing a medical emergency. In the other, she is a mother who has just been forced to confront the possibility that her own child was violated, repeatedly, under her roof. The hospital staff ask routine questions. Grace's medical history. Her medications. When the fever began. Whether she ate. Denise answers automatically, like her mouth is working separately from her mind. But the nurses aren't the ones who will ask the question that matters. Because the question that matters isn't medical. It's criminal. Who could have done this? A boyfriend? No. Grace doesn't have that kind of social independence. A stranger? Unlikely. A neighbor? Possible, but how? Someone from school. Denise remembers the school had been a place of routine, not chaos. There had been staff and teachers, structure and supervision. The pregnancy means someone had access outside supervision or access in private. And in Denise's mind, private means one place. Home. That realization arrives slowly, like the sound of a door closing far away. And when it fully clicks, it changes the temperature of her blood. Because home isn't just a place. Home is where the people closest to you live. Home is where trust isn't optional. It's survival. Denise thinks about the days Grace stayed home alone when school was out or Denise couldn't afford time off work. She thinks about who had keys. She thinks about who knew their routines. She thinks about who knew Grace could not easily fight back. Then her phone buzzes again. A notification from the home computer. And for a split second, her mind refuses to process it. But she taps it anyway. Because something inside her is already certain that whatever she's about to see is going to make the pregnancy look like only the beginning. The message is explicit enough that it doesn't leave room for confusion. It isn't a vague exchange. It's not suggestive. It's not flirtation. It's the language of a secret life. A life her husband has been living behind the surface of their marriage. A life that includes files, conversations, and a pattern. Denise's stomach turns so hard, she has to press her palm against the wall to steady herself. And then comes the thought that splits her in two. If Harold has been hiding this, what else has he been hiding? A nurse steps out of the room and tells Denise they need her. Grace's vitals are unstable. They're doing tests. Denise nods, walks forward. But she is no longer walking into her daughter's hospital room as a wife. She is walking in as someone who has to decide whether to keep her face calm while her entire world becomes evidence. Grace lies there, pale, sweating, her body rigid in the way cerebral palsy often makes it. Her breathing shallow, her eyes half open but distant. And Denise's heart breaks with a new kind of terror. Because pregnancy isn't just a violation. For Grace, pregnancy could be physically dangerous. It could be life-threatening. Grace's body is not built for it. No one prepared her for it. And now, Denise has to fight on two fronts at once. To keep her daughter alive. And to figure out who did this before the person responsible disappears back into the normal rhythm of family life. Unnoticed, untouched, unpunished. Denise leans close, brushing hair from Grace's forehead. Grace doesn't react like she normally would. No small smile. No soft movement of recognition. Just emptiness. Withdrawal. Denise feels it then, like an invisible weight pressing down. Grace isn't just sick. Grace is frightened. Frightened in a way that doesn't come from fever. Frightened in a way that comes from experience. Denise doesn't know it yet, but the case has already begun. And the most terrifying part is this. The suspect is likely someone Denise knows. Someone she trusted. Someone who has already rehearsed how to look innocent. And as Denise stands at Grace's bedside, the last bit of her old life still clinging to her like a thin thread, she realizes one truth that makes everything colder. The unthinkable didn't happen once. It happened repeatedly, while she was in the next room. And now she has to pull the thread, even if it tears everything apart. Denise's life wasn't glamorous. It wasn't filled with vacations, luxury, or safety nets. It was made of routine and effort. Wake early, work hard, stretch money, keep moving. She had grown up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in a house where the future was never promised. Her father worked maintenance at a Ford plant, coming home exhausted, smelling like grease and metal. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families, scrubbing bathrooms that were larger than Denise's bedroom. And Denise learned early. Nothing arrives unless you drag it toward you with both hands. She married young, to a man who seemed steady, good, predictable. When she became pregnant with Grace, she felt for the first time that the world was opening, like something pure had finally happened to her. But in February 1999, when Grace was born, that dream collapsed into something else. The doctors delivered the kind of news parents don't recover from quickly. Grace had cerebral palsy. Her muscles would tighten unpredictably. Coordination would be difficult. Mobility would be limited. She would require special education, therapy, constant support. And Denise, barely surviving financially, became a full-time mother, part-time worker, and round-the-clock caretaker. Her marriage didn't survive the wait. The father left. Just left. Not with a dramatic fight. Not with a clear villain speech. Just a quiet disappearance of responsibility. And Denise learned another truth. Sometimes people run because staying would require them to become better than they are. She raised Grace alone. For years. She fought insurance paperwork. She lifted Grace when Grace couldn't lift herself. She trained her arms, her own back, her own body into something stronger than it had ever needed to be. Grace was not a tragedy to Denise. Grace was her child. Grace was her reason. And over time, Denise built a small life that worked. School routines, therapy schedules, small joys. But loneliness doesn't stop existing just because you're strong. Loneliness just waits until you sit down at night. And that's how Harold arrived. Not as a sweeping romance. Not as some sudden rescue. He was just there, quiet, patient, attentive in the way exhausted people find comforting. Harold didn't overwhelm Denise. He didn't demand. He listened. He helped. He took Grace seriously, which mattered. He didn't treat her like a burden. He didn't look away. He showed up to school events. He volunteered. He made himself useful. And for Denise, that looked like love. A man willing to enter a hard life. A man who didn't run. When Harold proposed, Denise felt like she had finally outlasted the storm. She wasn't naive. She knew life could still break you. But she believed, deep down, that the worst had already happened. That belief becomes important later. Because one of the most dangerous things a human being can do is relax. Denise and Harold built a household around Grace. Harold became a second parent figure. He joined Denise in the long routines of disability care. He learned Grace's needs. He learned her limitations. He learned her patterns. And at first, it felt like stability. It felt like the kind of man Denise had prayed for when she was younger. Someone who didn't flinch at hardship. But stability can be an illusion, especially when the person providing it is also learning what your blind spots are. And Denise had blind spots. She had to. Because if you're constantly suspicious in a life that already hurts, you collapse from the stress. So Denise trusted Harold. Trusted him with her finances. Trusted him with her home. Trusted him with her child. Over the years, Harold's presence normalized. Not as the new husband, as family, which is exactly how predators survive in plain sight. Not by forcing entry through windows, but by being invited through the front door. Grace grew older. Puberty arrived, awkward and confusing. Denise did her best to guide Grace through bodily changes, hygiene, boundaries, things every parent teaches. But a child with cerebral palsy does not have the same independence as other teens. She needs help changing clothes, help bathing, help sometimes with menstrual care. And that assistance creates something disturbing, a situation where privacy becomes flexible, where boundaries depend on who is present, and where an adult with access can cross a line without immediate detection. At some point, Harold begins taking over Grace's evening baths. At first it makes sense. Denise is tired. Harold offers. He says he'll handle it. Denise doesn't argue. In fact, she feels grateful. This is what partnership looks like, she tells herself. And for a while, nothing seems wrong. But then small details begin appearing in the household like cracks in glass. Grace becomes quieter. She becomes less expressive after certain days. School staff start noticing something. Grace seems withdrawn after weekends, particularly after days she had been home alone with Harold. Denise receives those observations the way most parents do, half listening, half defensive, trying not to believe the worst. Maybe Grace is just tired. Maybe hormones. Maybe teenage mood swings. Denise doesn't want to suspect her husband, because suspecting him would mean admitting something else, that she may have delivered Grace into danger by choosing the wrong man. And that guilt is unbearable. So Denise explains it away. Until the hospital. Until the pregnancy. Until the computer. And then all the old maybes collapse. Now, the question is no longer abstract. Now it is sharp enough to cut bone. When did it start? Because it couldn't have started yesterday. Pregnancy doesn't happen overnight. It means months. It means time. It means repetition. Denise begins going back through memories like she's searching for hidden fingerprints. She remembers Harold's insistence that he help Grace with routines. His calm demeanor. The way he seemed almost too eager to take over. She remembers the way Grace flinched that morning when Denise touched her hair. And now, that flinch becomes different. Now it becomes meaning. Denise begins to realize a horrifying possibility. Grace may have been trying to signal distress without the ability to explain it. And if that's true, then this isn't just a crime. It's a slow suffocation of trust. A child trapped inside a body that can't fight, trapped inside a home that looked safe, trapped under the control of an adult who understood exactly how invisible she could be. By the time Denise walks back into the hallway, her mind has shifted. She is no longer simply a mother in shock. She is a mother who has begun building a timeline of betrayal. And she knows the timeline ends at one place. Her husband. But she still doesn't have proof. Not proof that would survive police scrutiny. Not proof that would survive a courtroom. Not proof that would protect Grace. So Denise makes a decision without fully saying it out loud. She is going to find the proof, even if it means tearing open every layer of her life to get it. Because the unthinkable isn't just that Grace is pregnant. It's that someone believed they could do it and still keep living as family. To understand how Denise reached this hospital hallway, how her life became a case file, you have to understand the ecosystem she lived in. It was never a life built on comfort. It was built on endurance. Denise wasn't wealthy enough to outsource caregiving. She wasn't supported enough to rest. Every day required calculations. Money, time, transportation, medication schedules. Grace's disability shaped everything. It shaped Denise's friendships, because spontaneous social life dies when every outing requires planning. It shaped Denise's job choices, because flexibility matters more than promotion. It shaped Denise's emotional world, because when you're responsible for someone vulnerable, fear becomes a background noise you stop noticing. That kind of life can make you intensely perceptive, but it can also make you intensely tired. And tired people accept help, sometimes without inspecting it properly. That's where Harold's role deepened. He arrived into a house that needed a second set of hands. And he became those hands. He was steady in the way Denise's first husband hadn't been. He didn't disappear when the reality of disability care became inconvenient. He leaned into it. He showed up. And he built a reputation inside Denise's mind. This is a man who stays. The more Harold stayed, the more he became woven into their daily structure. And structure is not just routine. Structure is authority. In families, the person who handles the hardest tasks becomes indispensable. Harold positioned himself there. At first, it would be small things, driving Grace to appointments, picking up groceries, helping with transfers. Then it became more intimate tasks, evening routines, bathing, changing clothes. Denise was grateful. She told herself she was lucky. She told herself this was what partnership should look like. But what Denise didn't recognize, because no one wants to recognize it, was that Harold was also learning where the quiet places were, where the gaps were, where the moment-to-moment supervision didn't exist. Because in real families, there is always a moment when someone is alone with the child. Always. And in this house, those moments grew more frequent. School days kept Grace busy, but school also had breaks. Holidays, sick days, administrative closures. Denise still had to work. And Harold, already established as safe, was present. So the household entered a dangerous pattern without anyone naming it. Grace alone with Harold. Again and again. To Denise, that wasn't a threat. It was relief. Because relief is rare in a caregiver's life. And what makes predators terrifying is that they often understand exactly what relief looks like. They offer it. They become it. Then they weaponize it. There were early signs, small but real. School staff noticing Grace's mood shifts. Grace withdrawing after weekends. Grace becoming unresponsive on some days in a way that felt more emotional than neurological. But these signs were ambiguous. And ambiguity is a predator's armor. Because when something is unclear, people hesitate to accuse. They hesitate because accusation destroys families. Accusation destroys marriages. Accusation destroys stability. And Denise, who had fought for stability her whole life, didn't want to be the one to detonate it. Harold, meanwhile, continued building trust. He didn't appear violent. He didn't appear unstable. He appeared helpful. He appeared normal. And normal is dangerous, because normal lowers defenses. At home, he acted like a good stepfather. At school, he volunteered. Publicly, he was a man doing the right thing. The outside world had no reason to suspect him. And that, too, is important because predators often depend on image the way others depend on oxygen. They live on reputation. They survive on being liked. They survive on people saying, "He could never." If Denise ever doubted him, she pushed the doubt down. Because she wanted to believe. Because she needed to believe. Because if Harold wasn't safe, then Denise had built her life on the wrong foundation again. And the thought of that humiliation, of that guilt, was too painful. But Grace's body was telling a story Denise hadn't heard yet. And it wasn't telling it with words. It was telling it with fear. Fear when Denise touched her hair. Fear during certain routines. The kind of fear a child learns when something happens in private and there is no language for it. This is the part outsiders don't understand. In cases involving disabled victims, the crime doesn't just happen physically. It happens structurally. The system creates dependence. Dependence creates access. Access creates opportunity. And if the perpetrator is inside the home, then the perpetrator controls not just the victim, but the narrative. Harold was in a position to control Grace's narrative because he could present himself as a caretaker. He could explain injuries as accidents. He could explain emotional withdrawal as her condition. He could frame everything through the lens of disability. And in many households, people accept those explanations. Because disability makes people uncomfortable. They don't want to ask detailed questions. They don't want to imagine anything dark. So they stay polite. They stay distant. And predators thrive in politeness. If Grace tried to resist, it might not look like resistance. It might look like agitation. If Grace tried to communicate distress, it might be interpreted as a behavioral episode. The disability itself becomes camouflage for the crime. Denise didn't understand that at first. She simply saw Grace as her child. She didn't see Grace as someone the world could exploit. But as Grace got older, the vulnerability expanded. A teenage girl inside an adult body. A body changing, developing, becoming sexualized by a world that is not always kind. And within the home, within that fragile structure Denise worked so hard to protect, Harold's role became more central. Until he wasn't just the husband. He was the gatekeeper of Grace's private world. Which means the crime, whatever it was, didn't require breaking in. It required only one thing. Denise looking away. And Denise looked away because she was exhausted. Because she was working. Because she was trying to survive. Because she trusted. That is the foundation of this case. Not violence. Not mystery. Trust. And the moment Denise finally realized trust had been weaponized against her, the foundation cracked. The pregnancy was the first visible fracture. The computer would become the collapse. And Denise, standing in that hospital, would soon discover that she hadn't just missed a sign. She had been living with the perpetrator. In the beginning, it didn't look like danger. It looked like stability. That's the cruel part of what happened inside that house. There was no obvious darkness at first. No shattered furniture. No screaming neighbors. No bruises that could be explained only one way. What Denise had was something far more deceptive. A man who wore responsibility like a uniform. A husband who volunteered at school, spoke politely to teachers, and carried himself as if he had been built for caregiving. The kind of man people nodded at in grocery store aisles. The kind of man who held doors open. The kind of man who never raised his voice in public. The kind of man people trusted. And when you are exhausted, when you are alone for years raising a child whose life depends on you, trust feels like oxygen. Denise didn't fall for Harold because he was charming. She fell for him because he was useful, because he helped without complaint, because he made life lighter. That was the ascent. Not money, not glamour, comfort. A home that felt functional. A routine that felt manageable. A partner who made Denise believe she could survive the next 10 years without being crushed by responsibility. But what Denise could not see was that comfort was not simply arriving. It was being engineered. Harold was building something inside that home, brick by brick. Access. Access to Grace's body. Access to Grace's privacy. Access to moments Denise could not supervise. And access, in cases like this, is rarely seized violently. It is earned. It is offered. It is normalized. It becomes invisible. At first, Harold's involvement was framed as support. Denise would come home late, bone-tired from work, and Harold would already have dinner going. Grace would be settled. The dishes would be rinsed. The living room would be quiet. Harold would speak softly, like he understood the fragility of their lives. And Denise would feel something she hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not just relief from physical tasks. Relief from fear. Because part of caregiving is always fear. Fear that something happens when you're not looking. Fear that you miss a symptom. Fear that your child suffers and you don't know. Harold seemed to reduce that fear. He seemed to make the home safer. And Denise began doing what exhausted people do when they finally receive help. She stopped watching as closely. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't irresponsibility. It was survival. The routines became smoother over time. Grace grew more familiar with Harold's presence. He became the one who drove to some appointments. The one who helped with daily transfers. The one who offered to take over when Denise needed rest. He made himself indispensable. And once a person becomes indispensable, questioning them feels like self-destruction. Because if Harold wasn't safe, then Denise had no safe option left. So the trust hardened. It became part of the family's identity, and it spread beyond the household. At school, Harold wasn't just Grace's stepdad. He was involved, present, cooperative. The teachers saw him as a steady adult in Grace's life. Some saw him as admirable. Some saw him as unusually attentive. And in another kind of story, that would be heroic. In this story, it was camouflage, because predators don't always hide by isolating. Sometimes they hide by blending so completely into the background of goodness that the very idea of suspicion feels wrong. Denise came to depend on Harold emotionally too. The years had trained her to carry everything alone. Harold's presence allowed her to share the load. And something subtle happens when a mother finally shares the load. Her vigilance relaxes. Not fully, not intentionally, but enough. Enough that a man with bad intentions can start doing things that would have been impossible in the early days. Small boundary shifts, small tests, small steps across invisible lines. A door left slightly closed during a routine that used to happen with the door open. A suggestion that Grace doesn't need her mother for everything. A gentle insistence that Denise should rest while he handles the evening routine. And every shift is small enough to seem reasonable. Because reasonable is the predator's favorite word. Reasonable, helpful, practical, nothing to worry about. Harold's confidence grew inside that space. Not because Denise gave him power directly, but because Denise stopped contesting his involvement. He began to behave as if he owned the household rhythm, as if he was the manager of Grace's care. Denise noticed it sometimes, small tensions, subtle insistence, the way Harold could get irritated if Denise questioned how he did things. But she interpreted it as stress, as fatigue, as the pressure of caregiving, the same pressure she lived with daily. So she excused it. That's another way danger spreads, through empathy. Denise believed she was being fair, understanding, kind. She didn't see that Harold's irritation wasn't the irritation of a man overwhelmed. It was the irritation of a man being observed. Because when someone is hiding something, questions don't feel like curiosity. They feel like threats. And Harold began preparing for threats without Denise realizing it. The household atmosphere grew controlled. Not openly, not dramatically, but controlled in the way certain people control their environment. What gets discussed? What gets dismissed? What gets normalized? Harold didn't have to say, "Don't look." He just guided Denise's attention away from the places he didn't want illuminated. The pattern had a rhythm. When Grace seemed withdrawn, Harold would suggest it was her condition. When school mentioned behavioral shifts, Harold would shrug, say she was tired. When Denise worried out loud, Harold would soothe her quickly, talk her down, redirect the focus. And because Denise wanted peace, because she wanted the home to work, she accepted the explanations. Until the pregnancy. The pregnancy was not a crack. It was a chasm. It was reality forcing itself into a narrative that could no longer hold. And now the ascent, the comfort, the stability, the trust, revealed itself as something else. A scaffold, a structure that had allowed something horrific to happen silently over time. When Denise returned home from the hospital after the first wave of tests, she didn't return as the same person. She moved through her living room like someone walking through a memory that no longer belongs to her. The couch looked the same. The family photos. The blankets folded on the chair. Grace's favorite items. All of it looked untouched. And yet, it felt contaminated. Because Denise realized something that disturbed her more than rage ever could. Whatever happened happened here. Not in the dark alleyways of crime documentaries. Not in unknown places. Inside her home. Inside her marriage. Grace's bedroom door, the handle Denise had turned 1,000 times, now looked like the entrance to a truth she couldn't bear. And Harold, moving through the kitchen, speaking calmly, looked like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Harold asked about Grace, his tone soft and concerned. The performance of concern. Denise watched him carefully in that moment, more carefully than she ever had. And she realized the scariest thing about him. He didn't look scared. He didn't look panicked. He looked prepared. That's when Denise began seeing small details she had overlooked before. The way Harold positioned himself physically between Denise and certain rooms. The way he asked questions, not out of love, but out of control, trying to gauge how much Denise knew. The way he spoke as if he could narrate reality into being. Denise started to understand. Harold wasn't just living with them. He was managing them. Managing Denise's exhaustion. Managing Grace's vulnerability. Managing the appearance of normal family life. And now, with pregnancy exposed, he would try to manage this too. Denise didn't confront him. Not yet. Not with words. Instead, she watched. And watching became its own kind of torture, because Harold continued behaving like nothing had changed. He laughed at small things. He watched television. He acted like a man who believed the world would keep turning in his favor. That confidence was chilling, because innocence doesn't require confidence. Innocence requires confusion, fear, a demand for answers. Harold demanded nothing, which meant Harold already knew the answers. Denise waited until Harold left the room. Then she moved. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like someone afraid of triggering an explosion. She walked toward the computer. This wasn't some sleek private office device. It was a household computer, a shared machine. But Harold treated it differently than the rest of the home. He protected it. He was particular about it. He didn't like Grace near it. He didn't like Denise clicking around in it. And in marriages, these details can be dismissed as quirks. Now they look like evidence. Denise sat down. Her hands shook so hard the mouse slipped slightly. The screen woke. A password prompt appeared. And in that moment, Denise felt the full weight of what she was doing. This wasn't snooping. This wasn't jealousy. This was a mother stepping into the only place where the truth might exist in a form that couldn't be denied. Denise tried a password she knew, their anniversary. Denied. She tried Grace's birthday. Denied. Harold's birthday. Denied. She tried combinations that made her feel sick. Denied. Every denial wasn't just technical. It felt like Harold standing behind her, guarding the door. Like the computer itself was saying, "This isn't for you." And that made Denise's determination sharper. Because if Harold didn't want her inside, there was only one reason. Denise found a notebook, an old one Harold sometimes wrote reminders in. She flipped through it with breath held tight. A scribble of numbers. A phrase. A pattern. She tried it. The password field cleared. The desktop loaded. And the instant the screen opened, Denise felt like the air changed. A normal desktop should look normal. Family photos. Bills. Work files. Nothing that feels secret. But what Denise saw was something else. Folders arranged neatly. Names that didn't belong in a household computer. A structure that felt organized like a private world. Not chaotic. Not accidental. Intentional. Denise clicked a folder. Inside were more folders, each labeled in a way that made her throat tighten. It wasn't random pornography. It wasn't ordinary adultery. It was categorized, curated, and it carried the unmistakable signature of obsession. This was someone who didn't stumble into wrongdoing. This was someone who built a system for it. Denise's eyes scanned file names and timestamps. And with each click, the horror deepened because it answered questions Denise hadn't dared to ask out loud. This wasn't new. This was not one moment. This had been going on for a long time. Long enough that Harold had built a secret architecture around it. Long enough that the man Denise married had been living two lives simultaneously. And then Denise found something that made her hands go cold. A series of communications. Messages. Conversations. Not just private fantasies, but exchanges that suggested planning, secrecy, and acts. And woven through those exchanges, Denise began recognizing patterns. Dates, times, references to things that had happened in her own home. It felt like Harold had been documenting a crime in plain sight. Denise leaned back slightly, eyes burning, and the realization finally locked into place like a bolt. The pregnancy wasn't the beginning of the nightmare. It was the first time the nightmare became visible, because Harold had not only violated trust, he had built a controlled world where the violation could continue indefinitely. He had engineered her blind spots. He had fed her comfort. He had used her exhaustion as cover. And the more Denise clicked, the more the truth emerged. This wasn't a husband hiding an affair. This was something darker. Something that crossed a line so final it destroyed the meaning of family. And in the quiet glow of that computer screen, Denise understood what the hospital hadn't told her yet, but her instincts already knew. Grace's pregnancy was not mysterious. It was not confusing. It had one terrifying explanation, and the proof was sitting right in front of her. But Denise still didn't know how far it went. She didn't yet understand how deliberate Harold's choices were. She didn't yet see the full scope. She had only opened the door, and what waited behind it wasn't just betrayal. It was a blueprint of abuse. And Denise had one thought that ended the last small part of her old life. If this is what he kept on the computer, what did he do in real life when nobody was watching? And somewhere in the house, Harold's footsteps moved again, getting closer. Denise's fingers hovered above the mouse. The screen glowed. The files waited. And the next decision she made, whether to shut it down or keep going, would determine whether the truth could ever be buried again. Denise didn't slam the laptop shut. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. Because the moment she saw what was on that screen, a strange survival instinct took over, one that felt colder than fear. Do not alert him. That thought arrived in her head with the clarity of a command. It wasn't courage. It wasn't strategy in the clean, cinematic sense. It was the same instinct that had carried her through years of caregiving. When something goes wrong, you don't panic first. You stabilize. You assess. You move quietly. And right now, Denise understood something that made her whole body go tight. If Harold realized she had opened the computer, he would know she had crossed into the one place he couldn't control with charm. And if he couldn't control it with charm, he might try something else. Denise forced herself to breathe slowly, like she was lowering herself into deep water. Her hands were shaking, but she made them behave. She clicked through folders with the precision of someone handling explosives. Each file name felt like a threat. Each timestamp felt like a confirmation. And beneath all of it was one certainty pressing against her skull. This wasn't just a secret life. This was a pattern, a routine, a system, the kind of system people build when they believe they'll never be caught. Denise's eyes moved from date to date, scanning for anchors, holidays, weekends, school breaks. Times she remembered being at work. Times Grace had been home. Times Harold had insisted he'd handle everything. And then the most disturbing thing happened. She began recognizing her own life in his timestamps. She saw evidence of her exhaustion encoded into the machine. Because every file wasn't just content. It was a time-stamped footprint of when the house belonged to Harold alone. When Denise had been gone. When Grace had been vulnerable. Denise felt something tear inside her. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a quiet mental fracture. Because she realized that Harold hadn't simply taken advantage of opportunity. He had waited for opportunity. He had watched her schedule. He had learned her weakest days. He had placed himself inside their routines like a parasite that couldn't survive without intimacy. And now Denise was sitting at the center of it, staring at the evidence of a crime committed inside trust. A sound from the hallway snapped her back. Footsteps. Harold moving again. Denise's pulse spiked, so hard she felt it in her throat. She minimized the windows quickly, forcing her fingers to stay steady. She opened something harmless, an old document file, then clicked away again, constructing a fake innocence in case Harold looked over her shoulder. The footsteps paused. Denise held her breath. Then they moved away. Denise didn't move until she was sure he was gone. Only then did she exhale, trembling. That moment changed everything. Because it wasn't just proof she needed. It was control. If Harold sensed she was onto him, she couldn't predict what he would do next. And for Denise, uncertainty wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Grace was still in the hospital. Grace was still vulnerable. And Harold was still free. Denise clicked back into the folders. Faster now, more desperate, because time had become something sharp and hostile. Then she found the thing that forced her to cover her mouth to stop herself from making a sound. A file. A sequence. A label that connected the digital world to the physical one. And suddenly the computer wasn't just hiding obscene material or private conversations. It was documenting access. Documenting acts. documenting a reality Denise didn't want to believe was possible inside her home. Denise stared at the screen, and her mind jumped to the hospital again. The moment the doctors confirmed what she'd already suspected. Grace was pregnant. Not speculation. Not rumor. Medical fact. And pregnancy brings biology into the room like a witness that cannot be bribed. It creates a timeline. It creates evidence. It creates proof. Which meant Harold's secret architecture, his years of invisibility, had just been shattered by the one thing he couldn't control. Grace's body telling the truth. Denise closed her eyes and forced herself to think like someone who needed to keep her child alive. Not like someone who needed to rage. She needed to do this correctly. Because if she moved wrong, the truth could slip away. And Denise sensed, deeply, that Harold was the kind of person who would destroy evidence without hesitation. She had seen how neat and organized the folders were. That wasn't the behavior of a man living casually. That was the behavior of someone managing risk. Denise reached for her phone and began taking photos of the screen. Not all of it, just enough. Folder names, file lists, anything that could show structure, anything that could show intent. She worked quickly, quietly, capturing proof the way someone grabs life rafts from a sinking ship. Then her phone buzzed. Hospital number. Denise answered with her voice carefully controlled. The nurse's tone wasn't casual. They needed Denise back immediately. Grace's condition was still unstable, and there was more. Tests, questions, paperwork, specialists. Denise said she was coming. She hung up and stared at the computer one last time. And then she realized something that made her blood run cold. If she left now, Harold would be alone in the house. Alone with that computer. Alone with the evidence. Alone with the ability to erase everything. Denise's mind sprinted. If she stayed, she risked Harold suspecting her. If she left, she risked losing proof. If she confronted him, she risked violence. Because now she knew enough about what he had done to understand that he wasn't simply a husband who made a mistake. Men who do this don't panic the way ordinary people panic. They calculate. They protect themselves. They rewrite reality. And when reality won't rewrite, they destroy it. Denise shut down the computer carefully. Not abruptly. She wanted it to look normal. Then she did the only thing she could think of. She took the power cord with her. A small act. A weak act, in a way. But it bought time. And time, she now understood, was the most valuable thing in the world. Denise returned to the hospital feeling like she was carrying a bomb inside her chest. In the waiting area, everything looked normal. Families sitting, nurses moving, televisions playing quietly. And Denise wanted to scream because how could the world be normal when her home had become a crime scene? She met with doctors again. They discussed Grace's pregnancy in medical terms. Weeks along. Risks. Care plans. Options. But Denise's mind wasn't absorbing the medical language the way it should have. Because beneath the medical questions was one larger truth. A pregnancy like this demanded investigation. Because Grace, due to her disability, was legally and practically vulnerable. She couldn't consent. She couldn't protect herself. And that fact wasn't emotional. It was legal. It was criminal. A social worker arrived. Then another. Hospital staff weren't naive. They'd seen cases before where pregnancy in a dependent disabled person signaled abuse. They asked Denise calm questions. Who lives at home? Who has access? Who helps with bathing and dressing? Who is alone with Grace? Denise answered, and every answer felt like a rope tightening. Because every answer had one name at the end of it. Harold. The social worker's face remained professional, but Denise saw the shift, an almost invisible tightening of attention. A sharpened focus. The questions became more pointed. Had Grace ever acted fearful around anyone? Had she shown bruises, discomfort, unusual anxiety? Denise's throat dried out. She thought about the flinch, the withdrawal, the weekends, the things she explained away because she wanted peace. And she felt a different kind of sickness now. Not just horror at Harold, but guilt at herself. Because once you know the truth, you can't pretend you didn't ignore the signs. Denise felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she didn't allow them to fall in front of the staff. Not because she wanted to look strong, because she wanted to look credible, because she suddenly understood that her daughter's life might depend not just on medicine, but on whether adults believed Denise. She asked to speak to law enforcement. Quietly, directly, no theatrics, because she knew if she acted hysterical, Harold's lawyers could later use it to paint her as unstable. Denise was thinking like someone already in a courtroom. That's what pressure does to people. It accelerates them into survival logic. A police officer arrived, then a detective, and in that small hospital room with the door closed, Denise began telling the story. Not the emotional story, the factual story. Grace's condition, the pregnancy discovery, the computer, the files, the way Harold had become the primary caretaker during vulnerable routines. The detective listened carefully. When Denise mentioned the computer evidence, the detective's eyes changed. Because in cases like this, proof is rare. And digital proof, if preserved, can be devastating. But the detective also knew what Denise feared. Evidence can vanish. People delete things. Computers get broken. Files disappear. Denise told them she had photos. Not everything, but enough to show what she saw. The detective asked to see them. Denise handed over her phone. And the moment the detective scrolled through those images, Denise watched professionalism become something sharper, something colder. Because those folder names weren't ambiguous. They didn't look like accident. They looked like intent. The detective told Denise something that made her stomach turn again. They would need to secure the home. They would need to seize the computer. They would need to interview Harold. Not eventually. Soon. Because the moment Harold realized suspicion had formed, he would act. Denise knew that too. She nodded. But inside, panic began crawling up her spine because her brain caught up to something terrifying. Harold doesn't know she knows yet. Which means Harold still believes he controls the narrative. Which means Harold will behave normally until the moment he doesn't. And the moment he doesn't might be violent. Not necessarily physically violent, though it could be, but violent in the way he might attempt to destroy evidence, manipulate Grace's story, or flee. Fleeing would mean Denise might never see accountability. It would mean the truth could become a mystery instead of a conviction. Denise asked, "What happens now?" The detective's answer was careful. They couldn't arrest Harold without securing more evidence. Not yet. They needed to move strategically. They needed to confirm timelines, gather medical statements, preserve proof from the computer. They needed to approach this like a case that would go to trial. Which meant Harold couldn't just be confronted. He had to be trapped by the facts. Denise listened, and in that moment, she felt the full brutality of real criminal investigations. There is no instant justice. There is only process, and process gives predators time. Denise's hands clenched. Because every extra hour Harold remained free felt like Grace being endangered all over again. The detective promised they would move quickly. They also told Denise something else, something chilling that made Denise's skin prickle. In cases involving disabled victims, perpetrators often rely on one advantage above all others. They assume the victim won't be believed. They assume the victim can't testify clearly. They assume the victim can't explain. They assume the victim can't fight. And if that assumption holds, they get away with everything. Harold likely believed that. And that belief was part of why he became so confident. Denise left the meeting feeling like her life had become two timelines. One timeline where she continued being a mother in a hospital trying to keep her child alive. Another timeline where she had become the primary witness in a criminal investigation against her own husband. And those timelines were about to collide. Because Harold would soon realize something. Maybe through a call. Maybe through a knock on the door. Maybe through police presence. But he would realize that the quiet structure he built, the hidden folders, the controlled routines, had been exposed by the one person he underestimated. Denise. The question now wasn't whether the truth existed. Denise had already seen it. The question was what Harold would do when he understood the truth was no longer his to control. And Denise couldn't shake the feeling that when Harold felt cornered, he wouldn't simply surrender. He would try to erase, to rewrite, to escape. And the scariest part was this. The moment Harold sensed the investigation closing in, Grace would be the least protected person in the story. Because if Harold had been capable of doing what Denise suspected, then protecting himself might mean destroying the one witness who couldn't speak loudly. Denise looked back at Grace through the hospital room window. Her daughter lay still, fragile, unaware of the battle forming around her. And Denise realized she had crossed into a new phase of the nightmare. Not discovery, not suspicion, war. Because now it wasn't just about what happened. It was about whether Harold could be stopped before he did it again. And somewhere, back at home, Harold was walking around as if everything was normal, unaware that the walls were already closing. But not for long, because the next knock on his door would not be friendly. And the next time Denise saw Harold, she might be looking at him not as a husband, but as a suspect who still believed he had time to destroy everything. The first fracture didn't happen when the police arrived. It happened earlier, quietly, inside Harold. Because people like him don't wait for consequences to land before they start preparing. They feel shifts in the atmosphere the way animals feel storms. A delayed phone call, a change in Denise's voice, a hospital visit that lasts too long, a routine that suddenly bends in a direction he didn't plan for. Harold had built his life on control, and control isn't just about access. It's about information. Who knows what? Who suspects what? Who is still asleep? And Denise, without meaning to, had started moving differently. She had started answering him with shorter sentences. She had started asking fewer questions. She had started holding her phone closer, like it contained something fragile. To Denise, these were survival reflexes. To Harold, they were signs. And once he began suspecting that the narrative was no longer entirely his to manage, his behavior shifted in ways so subtle most people wouldn't even call it suspicious. But Denise noticed. Because when you live with someone long enough, you learn their normal. You learn the rhythm of their footsteps, the tone of their casual voice, the speed with which they do ordinary tasks. Harold's rhythm tightened. He moved faster through the house, like he was trying to get ahead of something invisible. He checked his phone more often. He asked too many questions about Grace's condition, questions framed like concern, but calibrated like surveillance. And Denise could feel something in him that had not been there before. Calculation. The hospital became the center of gravity. Denise spent long hours there, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, talking to nurses, answering questions from staff. And Harold, staying supportive, began showing up more frequently. At first, that might sound normal. Husband shows up in crisis. But what Denise noticed was the way he positioned himself in those rooms. Not at Grace's bedside in protective love, but near Denise, near conversations, near doors, like he needed to hear what was being said, like he needed to measure risk. He smiled at nurses. He spoke politely to doctors. He offered to bring coffee. And Denise realized something new and unsettling. Harold wasn't just good at blending in at home. He was good at blending in everywhere. He knew how to perform normal. And performance is dangerous because it disorients the people around it. A nurse might think, what a supportive stepfather. A doctor might think, this family is help. A social worker might think, there's a stable home here. That's what predators feed on. The assumption that evil looks chaotic. But often, evil looks cooperative. Denise began separating herself psychologically. Even when Harold was in the room, she felt alone. Because she could no longer share reality with him. He was no longer her partner in crisis. He was the suspected source of the crisis. And it created a split inside Denise's mind that became harder to live with each hour. If she exposed Harold, she might shatter her own life. If she didn't, she might leave Grace trapped in danger. Every choice was a knife. Meanwhile, the official machine began turning. Investigators moved quietly at first because they had to. If Harold realized law enforcement was circling, he would have time to destroy evidence. So they treated him like a shadow, watching him without letting him feel watched. But the problem with someone like Harold is that he lived inside that house like a spider inside a web. He felt vibration. He felt disturbance. And the moment he sensed it, he began securing himself. Denise noticed changes at home. When she returned briefly to grab clothes, the household felt different, like someone had cleaned too thoroughly. Not in the normal, I'm helping way. In the I'm resetting the scene way. Items moved slightly. Drawers organized differently. The computer desk wiped spotless. The air smelled faintly of cleaner, sharp and artificial. And Denise's mind screamed the thought she couldn't say aloud. He's erasing, not just evidence, memory, the shape of the home, the casual mess that proves people live their lives normally. He was trying to restore the appearance of harmlessness. Denise didn't confront him. She couldn't, because confrontation would warn him. And warning him would activate a different side of Harold, one Denise had never seen, but now believed existed. So she played the role Harold expected. She acted exhausted, distracted, overwhelmed. She let him talk. She let him offer help. She let him look like the caring husband. And inside, Denise hated herself for doing it, because every second she played along felt like complicity. But Denise understood something critical. In real life, justice isn't achieved by emotion. It's achieved by patience, by evidence, by timing. In the hospital, Grace's condition stabilized slightly, but the pregnancy remained the central issue. More specialists were brought in, more testing, more quiet conversations outside Grace's room. And each time Denise stepped into those conversations, she could feel Harold trying to step in too. He would appear casually, like coincidence. He would offer to come along. He would ask what the doctor said. He would insert himself into the flow of information like a dam. Denise's fear evolved. At first, her fear had been about what happened to Grace. Now her fear expanded into something larger. What Harold would do now that the truth was waking up. Because predators do not respond to exposure the way ordinary people do. Ordinary people panic. Predators strategize. And Harold's strategy began showing through his cracks. One afternoon, Denise watched him speak to a nurse with a warm smile, then turn away and lose the smile instantly, as if it was a mask he could remove at will. The shift was so quick it made Denise's stomach knot. That wasn't normal fatigue. That was controlled presentation. And that kind of control meant Harold was capable of acting one way while thinking another, which meant if he ever turned on Denise, it would not be loud. It would be surgical. The fracture spread. The marriage became a hallway with no doors, just distance. Denise realized Harold was watching her too. He wasn't just asking questions. He was studying her, trying to gauge what she knew, trying to measure how close she was to collapsing, trying to find her weak points. And Denise felt the psychological pressure that victims' families often feel in these cases. The perpetrator is not in some distant world. He is close enough to touch. He knows you. He knows your habits. He knows where you keep your keys, where you keep your documents, how you react to stress. He knows what you fear. And Denise feared one thing above all, that Harold would do something irreversible before the law could stop him. Then, the moment arrived, small, quiet, but definitive. A police officer asked Harold to step aside for questioning. Not in handcuffs, not as an arrest, just a conversation. But Denise watched Harold's face change for half a second, something hard flashing behind his eyes before the pleasant mask returned. And Denise understood. He knew. He knew the net had been thrown. Maybe he didn't know how tight it was yet, but he knew it existed. The pressure shifted into a new category. Harold began making calls outside the hospital. Denise could see him stepping away to talk, voice low, eyes scanning. When he returned, he was overly calm, overly helpful. The kind of calm that looks comforting to outsiders, but feels terrifying to someone who knows what's underneath. Because it didn't look like innocence. It looked like rehearsed control. The detective spoke to Denise privately. They had begun formal procedures. They needed to secure the home computer. They needed to execute proper legal steps. They needed to document Grace's condition and vulnerability. They needed to ensure anything recovered could stand in court. Denise asked the question she didn't want to ask. How long? The detective didn't give an exact answer, but the message was clear. Not long enough to feel safe. Because every case moves slower than panic. And panic was exactly what Denise could sense building inside Harold, hidden behind his smile. The most fragile part of the case now wasn't the evidence. It was Grace. Because Grace was vulnerable in ways most people will never understand. She couldn't simply run away. She couldn't avoid him. She couldn't fight back. Which meant, In the cold logic of a predator, Grace wasn't just a victim. She was a risk, a witness, a living consequence. And the more Harold felt the walls closing in, the more dangerous that made him. This is where the fracture becomes psychological warfare. Denise began sleeping less, eating less. Her mind was always on, always replaying scenes. Every time Harold entered Grace's room, Denise's body tightened. Every time he touched Grace's shoulder gently, Denise felt nausea. Every time he spoke softly to her daughter, Denise felt rage so sharp she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from reacting. Because Harold was still pretending, still acting like family, still sitting in the role he had used as cover. And that role gave him proximity. Proximity is power. Then Denise noticed something else, something that terrified her far more than the computer ever did. Grace's behavior around Harold. Grace couldn't communicate everything clearly, but her body communicated enough. When Harold entered, Grace's eyes would shift away. Her muscles would tighten. Her breathing would change slightly. Not always, because trauma doesn't behave consistently, but enough that Denise felt it. Grace recognized him as a threat, and that recognition, silent, physical, was the closest thing Denise had to confirmation from her daughter. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was reality. The fracture deepened into a break. Denise stopped seeing Harold as a man. She began seeing him as a mechanism, a predator wearing human skin. And the question changed again. It was no longer, did Harold do this? The question became, how far did he go, and what is he willing to do now to keep himself free? Because the next phase of these cases, the phase investigators fear most, is when the perpetrator realizes the story is no longer his. When control is gone. And when control is gone, some people do not surrender. They destroy. They flee. They retaliate. They attempt to rewrite reality one final time. And Denise could feel that moment approaching like thunder in the distance. A storm not yet visible, but already in motion. One evening, Harold returned home alone while Denise remained at the hospital. He said he needed to grab some things. He said he'd come right back. He sounded normal. But Denise's instinct screamed. Because this was his chance. A window. A moment of private access to the home. To the computer. To anything. Denise texted the detective immediately. The response was urgent. They were moving. Fast. Because if Harold had one private hour inside that home with suspicion forming, he could destroy everything. Denise sat in Grace's hospital room, staring at her daughter's sleeping face, and felt the most helpless kind of fear, being close to the victim while the perpetrator roamed free. Denise didn't know what Harold was doing at home. She didn't know if he was deleting files, wiping drives, burning documents, packing a bag, preparing to disappear. She didn't know if he was rehearsing a story, or worse, if he was planning something that would permanently silence the truth. Denise's phone buzzed again. A message, not from the detective, from Harold. Short, casual. Everything's fine. Just grabbing things. Be back soon. Denise stared at the screen and felt the hair on her arms rise. Because it didn't read like reassurance. It read like control. Like someone trying to keep the victim calm while they move unseen. Denise didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. Her fingers were stiff. Her mind was screaming that she was running out of time. Because the fracture stage is when families still hope things can be handled quietly. But this case was already past quiet. And Harold, whether Denise wanted to admit it or not, was no longer simply her husband. He was now a suspect with everything to lose. And suspects with everything to lose sometimes do the worst thing imaginable. Not because they're emotional, but because they're calculating. Denise looked down at Grace, vulnerable and unconscious under hospital lights, and realized they had exposed Harold's secret world, but they had not yet stopped Harold. And the next act of this story would not be about discovery. It would be about survival. Because once the predator senses the trap, the predator moves. When Harold left the hospital that evening, he didn't walk out like a man going to grab toiletries. He walked out like a man checking the perimeter of his own life. And that's the moment Denise understood something that no true crime documentary prepares you for until you live it. The most dangerous time is not when you don't know. The most dangerous time is when you finally do. Because once you know, the other person knows you might act. And once they suspect you might act, they stop behaving like a spouse. They start behaving like someone protecting themselves. Denise sat in the hospital room with the lights dimmed, Grace sleeping in fragile stillness, monitors humming softly in the background. The machines didn't sound dramatic. They sounded routine, like normal life continuing. But Denise could no longer tell the difference between routine and threat. Her mind ran through possibilities like a police scanner. Harold deletes everything. Harold destroys the computer. Harold wipes the hard drive. Harold creates a false narrative. Harold calls a lawyer. Harold packs a bag. Harold disappears. And then the possibility Denise didn't want to acknowledge. If Harold could do what Denise suspected, then he wasn't just capable of deception. He was capable of cruelty, which meant the next move wasn't necessarily digital. It could be physical. It could be direct. It could be irreversible. Denise checked the door again and again. Not because she expected Harold to storm in, but because she had started understanding predators in a new way. They don't always rage. They appear calm. They appear reasonable. They show up with a smile. And they do damage quietly. Denise's phone buzzed. The detective. Short message. Sparse words. The kind of message that tells you without explanation that something has shifted. They were moving to secure the home. Now, Denise stared at that message and felt a cold wave pass through her body. Because a part of her, some exhausted part that still clung to the old world, had believed the investigation would unfold slowly, that there would be time to breathe, that law enforcement would do their work methodically. But the word now meant the police didn't trust time either. It meant Harold's actions had triggered urgency. It meant he'd done something, or was about to. And suddenly Denise wasn't just a witness. She was in a race. The detective's next message was worse. Harold was at the house. They believed he was attempting to access the computer. Denise's breath caught, not because she was surprised, because she felt the truth of it in her bones. Harold had gone to clean up, to erase, to disappear, to protect himself. And if he could erase the evidence, he could rewrite the story into whatever he wanted. He could blame Denise, blame misunderstandings, blame mental instability, blame Grace's condition. He could tell a court that Denise was paranoid, that he was being framed, that he was the loving stepfather, and Denise had snapped under pressure. This is what predators do. They move toward the simplest route to survival. And for Harold, survival meant eliminating proof. The detective told Denise to stay at the hospital, to keep Grace safe and supervised. Denise agreed. But fear doesn't obey reason. Fear makes you see the world in sharp fragments. Grace asleep. Harold at home. A computer full of evidence. Police on the way. A man realizing he is being hunted. The hospital room felt too small. Denise stood and paced softly, trying not to disturb Grace. Every few steps she would look back, as if her daughter might suddenly vanish. Because Denise had begun to grasp the darkest reality of this kind of case. The victim's vulnerability is the perpetrator's advantage right up until the end. And when the end approaches, some perpetrators try to remove the vulnerability by removing the victim. Denise shook the thought away, but it kept returning like a shadow you can't outrun. Outside, the world looked unchanged. Cars drove by. Streetlights glowed. People laughed in parking lots. Normal life always continues around horror. That's another cruel rule. Then the detective called. Denise answered instantly. His tone was different now, not calm, not conversational. Focused. Controlled urgency. They were executing the search. They were entering the home. Denise's throat tightened. The detective told her something that made her stomach flip. Harold had tried to block them. Not physically, not with violence, with performance. He acted confused, cooperative. He asked questions. He tried to delay. Delay is everything in cases like this. Because delay buys time to destroy, to wipe a drive, to dump a device, to smash a hard disk, to claim, I don't know what you're talking about. But police had probable cause. They entered anyway. Denise stood frozen in the hospital room, phone pressed to her ear, heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the words. Then the detective said, He's been on the computer. Just that. For words. And Denise felt as if she was falling. Because if Harold had been on the computer, he may have been deleting, hiding, encrypting, anything. Denise asked if they still had it. The detective didn't answer immediately. That pause was a cliff edge. Then yes, they were seizing it. They were securing digital evidence. They were taking other devices too. Phones. Storage. Anything connected. Denise felt relief. Tiny, sharp, incomplete. Because securing a computer isn't the same as proving a crime. And Harold wasn't in handcuffs yet. He was still a free man in their living room. Still able to breathe. Still able to talk. Still able to spin. The detective warned Denise. Harold was asking questions. He was trying to find out what Denise had said at the hospital. He was trying to determine the narrative. And then came a line that made Denise's blood run cold. He keeps asking about Grace. Not how is she? Not is she okay? But asking about her in a way that felt like checking the position of a chess piece. Where she is. Who is with her? Who has access? That's when Denise understood something that tightened fear into terror. Harold wasn't just worried about evidence. He was worried about the living proof. Grace. Denise sat down hard in the chair next to the bed, staring at her daughter's sleeping face. Grace's breathing was shallow but steady. Denise reached out and held her hand. And in that contact, Denise felt both the softness of motherhood and the brutal weight of responsibility. Grace couldn't protect herself. Grace couldn't even fully understand what was happening around her. She was the center of the storm without being able to name it. The detective said they were bringing Harold in for questioning. Not arrest yet. Questioning. They needed to see what he said, what he denied, what he admitted. They needed to trap him with his own words. Denise asked, "What if he runs?" The detective assured her they were watching him closely. But the detective couldn't promise what Denise wanted most. That Grace was permanently safe. Because in the real world, safety isn't a feeling. It's logistics. It's placement. It's supervision. It's legal custody. And right now, Harold was still technically part of the household. Still technically family. Denise felt rage surge. Because the word family now felt like poison. Over the next hours, things moved in a blur. Harold was questioned. Grace's medical assessments continued. Social workers documented. Police documented. Everything became paperwork and statements. And while that sounds dull, bureaucratic, it was deadly serious. Because paperwork is what makes courtrooms move. It's what turns horror into conviction. Denise gave additional statements. She showed the detective the photos she'd taken of the computer screen. Each photo was a fragment of a secret world. The detective's response wasn't emotional. It was procedural, because emotions don't hold up in court. Evidence does. The forensic analysis would take time. Hard drives have to be imaged. Files have to be recovered. Deletions have to be tracked. Timelines built. But the mere fact that Harold had tried to access the computer under pressure, this mattered. It suggested consciousness of guilt. It suggested awareness. It suggested panic. Then Harold did something Denise never expected. He called her. From the police station. Denise stared at her phone as if it were a venomous animal. She didn't want to answer. But she did. Because she needed to hear his voice. Not out of love. Out of analysis. Harold's voice was calm. Too calm. He asked about Grace. He said he was worried. He said the police were overreacting. He said someone must be misunderstanding something. His words were smooth. Practiced. And Denise felt something horrifying. He was trying to pull her back into the old world. Back into denial. Back into his control. He didn't accuse her openly. He didn't threaten her. He didn't need to. Instead, he used something more manipulative. He spoke as if he were still her partner. Still her protector. Still her steady man. Denise listened and realized. Harold wasn't panicking the way she expected. He was bargaining. He was trying to see if Denise would soften. If she would doubt herself. If she would say something that could be used against her later. Because predators don't just seek physical access. They seek narrative dominance. They want to control what the victim believes happened. What the family believes happened. What the community believes happened. Harold's voice carried that intention like an undercurrent. Denise didn't give him anything. She kept her responses minimal. Neutral. She didn't argue. Arguing feeds them. It gives them material. Instead, she ended the call quickly. And when she hung up, she realized her hands were shaking. Not because she feared Harold as a man in a police station, but because she feared the kind of mind Harold had. A mind that could sound tender while hiding brutality. A mind that could commit the unthinkable and still speak like nothing was wrong. That call was the point of no return. Because Denise understood now, Harold would never confess voluntarily. He would deny until denial stopped working. He would manipulate until manipulation stopped working. And once those tools failed, he would resort to something else. Denise could feel the case hardening into inevitability. Either Harold would be convicted, or he would destroy everyone's lives trying to avoid it. The next morning, Harold was released pending further investigation. That detail, small on paper, was enormous in real life, because it meant Harold was still out there, still free, still able to come home if the system didn't block him, still able to run, still able to retaliate. Denise was told there would be protective steps, but protective steps take time, and time was exactly what Harold needed. That night, Denise didn't sleep. She watched Grace. She listened to hallway sounds. She imagined Harold's car outside. Every shadow felt sharp, and she realized the fracture wasn't just in the marriage. It was in Denise's entire nervous system. She would never again know peace the way she knew it before, because Harold had turned peace into camouflage. And in the quiet hours before dawn, Denise saw the truth. What Harold did wasn't just abuse. It was conquest. A slow conquest of access, silence, and control. And now the conquest was collapsing, which meant Harold would be desperate. And desperate people do irreversible things. The point of no return had arrived not as a single dramatic act, but as a chain of decisions. Denise opening the computer. Denise photographing evidence. Denise speaking to the hospital staff. Denise speaking to police. Police seizing the devices. Harold realizing he was exposed. There was no going back. No working it out. No misunderstanding. No family discussion. Now there was only one path forward. Exposure. Trial. Judgment. And that path would destroy what remained of normal life. But Denise no longer cared about normal. She cared about one thing. Grace surviving this. Grace being protected. Grace being believed. And as the investigation deepened, the next stage would arrive. Inevitable, brutal. The fall. Because the moment evidence becomes undeniable, the predator's mask doesn't slip gently. It rips. Harold didn't fall in one dramatic moment. He fell the way some structures collapse, quietly at first, then all at once. Because once the police took the computer, the case stopped being emotional and became mechanical. It stopped being Denise's nightmare and became a forensic process. And forensic processes don't care about charm. They don't care about smiles. They don't care about good stepfather performances in school hallways. They care about patterns, timestamps, recovered files, search history, deleted fragments that still live in the ghost memory of a hard drive. Harold may have believed that what he erased was gone forever, but the modern world has an ugly permanence. And within days, detectives were no longer relying on Denise's instincts. They were building a timeline. And timelines, cold, precise, have a way of turning a man into a suspect, then a suspect into a certainty. Denise watched the process from the outside, trapped in the strange purgatory that families of victims experience. You are both essential and irrelevant. You're the one who sounded the alarm, and yet you're no longer driving the machine. The law takes over. Procedures take over. Specialists take over. Denise's job became something else. Waiting. And waiting is torture when you know the person capable of violating your child is still breathing freely somewhere. Harold continued acting like a man who thought the world might still bend back into place. When he spoke to Denise, he spoke carefully, not aggressively, not openly threatening. He leaned on confusion and sympathy. He made it sound like the investigation was an inconvenience rather than an accusation. He suggested misunderstandings. He suggested exaggerations. He suggested that people were drawing crazy conclusions. And every time he spoke, Denise understood more clearly what she was dealing with. not a husband who had made mistakes, a man who believed he could talk reality into being. Harold's most dangerous weapon wasn't violence. It was narrative. He tried to take ownership of the story before it could harden into a case file. Because Harold knew something that Denise was learning in real time. In court, the story matters almost as much as the evidence. So he began shaping the story around himself. He spoke to friends. He spoke to family. He spoke to anyone who would listen. He positioned himself as a victim of accusation, a man being hunted unfairly, a caretaker being punished for helping. He implied Denise was unstable, overwhelmed by years of caregiving, cracking under pressure. That kind of strategy works frighteningly well because people want easy explanations. They want to believe in normal. They want to believe the man they smiled at in the grocery store line couldn't possibly be hiding something dark. Denise realized quickly Harold was trying to recruit disbelief. He was building social armor. And for a brief moment, it almost worked. In small towns, reputation is currency. The image of a good man can survive longer than evidence should allow. People hesitate to accept that evil can live in their neighborhoods because accepting it forces them to reevaluate their own instincts. Denise saw it in the way people looked at her. Some looked sympathetic, others looked cautious, and a few looked like they were waiting to see which version of the story would win. Denise couldn't blame them fully. Not yet. Because until the evidence surfaced, everything still existed in that foggy space of accusation and denial. But that fog didn't last. It never lasts when digital evidence is involved. The detectives recovered files. Some had been deleted. Some had been moved. Some had been hidden. But recovery tools don't care whether someone meant well. They don't care whether someone seemed normal. They pull back the mask bite by bite. And what they found wasn't just disturbing. It was structured. It suggested long-term obsession, long-term planning, long-term behavior. Not a momentary lapse. A lifestyle. An identity. The case didn't stay small. It couldn't. Because once the evidence began to point toward criminal behavior, the system widened the lens. Investigators don't just ask, "Did he do this?" They ask, "What else has he done?" They looked into Harold's past, his employment, his previous contacts, his access. They began examining whether Grace was the only victim. And that possibility, Grace being only one part of a larger pattern, hit Denise like a second earthquake, because it reframed the entire marriage. It suggested that Denise hadn't just married the wrong man. She had invited a predator into her home who may have been hunting long before he ever met her. Denise began replaying the years with a new kind of horror. Had Harold chosen her because she was lonely? Because she was exhausted? Because she had a disabled daughter? Because disability created easy access and reduced credibility? Because people tend to assume vulnerable individuals don't understand what happens to them. The idea that Harold might have selected their household as the perfect environment for secrecy turned Denise's stomach. And then the fall accelerated. The investigators' attention sharpened around one core truth. Grace could not consent. Her disability placed her in a legally protected category. Any sexual contact involving her wasn't immoral. It was criminal. It was exploitation of a dependent person. That reality destroyed Harold's preferred narrative, because his narrative required ambiguity. Predators love ambiguity. They thrive in it. They hide inside it. But Grace's situation created moral clarity. And moral clarity is lethal to someone like Harold. Once investigators formed confidence, Harold's life began to unravel publicly. He was no longer just being questioned. He was being watched. Neighbors heard rumors. School personnel heard whispers. The community image he had built, the helpful stepfather, the stable adult, began to rot from the inside out. The fall wasn't just legal. It was social. It was psychological. And that matters, because predators often care about image even more than freedom. Image is how they feed. Image is how they access victims. Image is how they recruit trust. And now that image was collapsing, Denise saw it in the way Harold changed. He wasn't calm anymore. He became brittle. His friendliness turned forced. His patience shortened. He began displaying irritation that leaked through the mask. The man who had once seemed steady began feeling unpredictable. It was the first time Denise saw the core beneath him. Not a caregiver, not a partner, a man losing control. In the pressure of exposure, Harold made mistakes. He contradicted himself in statements. He attempted explanations that didn't align with evidence. He tried to downplay what was found, suggesting it was just online content or misunderstood material. But the investigators weren't looking at it in isolation. They were looking at it as part of a story that began in Denise's home and ended with Grace's pregnancy. And that chain, pregnancy to caretaker access to digital patterns, was a noose tightening. Denise learned that the detectives were preparing charges. The moment she heard that, she didn't feel relief. Relief would imply closure. What Denise felt was something darker. Vindication mixed with dread. Because charging Harold would not erase what happened. It would not rewind time. It would not remove the images in Denise's head. The thought of her daughter being violated in her own bedroom while Denise worked to keep the lights on. Charging Harold would only move the story into the next stage. Court, cross-examinations, public exposure. The kind of exposure that tears families apart and leaves psychological scars on everyone involved. Denise also knew something else. If Harold was charged, he would stop bargaining. He would stop pretending. He would move into survival mode. And survival mode could look like fleeing or retaliation or spinning the narrative even harder. Denise strengthened security. She stayed close to Grace. She limited contact. She complied with investigators' advice. But fear doesn't vanish just because procedures exist. Fear remains because Harold remained unpredictable. Then came the moment Harold finally realized his usual tools were failing. The charges were real. The evidence was recovering. The story was no longer his. And in response, he did what many predators do when cornered. He attempted to flip the victim and the protector. He implied Denise had coached Grace. He implied Denise had manipulated the situation. He implied Denise was inventing a story to destroy him. He tried to turn the world upside down. This strategy, attacking the credibility of the family, works more often than people want to admit, especially when the victim is disabled. Because disability is weaponized against victims constantly. People question comprehension. People question communication. People question reliability. And Harold counted on that. He counted on the idea that Grace could not clearly testify. He counted on the discomfort society has with disabled bodies. He counted on people not wanting to look too deeply. But the computer didn't have discomfort. The forensic report didn't hesitate. The medical reality didn't stutter. Grace's pregnancy stood like a physical fact that could not be argued away. And suddenly Harold's elaborate image, years of careful blending, collapsed rapidly, like wet paper. The helpful man became the suspicious man. The stable husband became the accused. The family caretaker became the target of a criminal investigation. That is what a fall looks like in real cases. Not a chase scene, not a confession, a slow suffocation of credibility, until the world finally sees you the way your victim always did. Denise watched the fall with numb eyes. Because by the time Harold's public mask collapsed, Denise had already lost something bigger. The illusion that the world is safe if you work hard enough. She learned a more brutal lesson. Sometimes danger comes wearing your wedding ring. Sometimes the monster offers to help with baths. And now, as Harold's world crumbled, Denise could feel the final act approaching. Not closure, not healing, aftermath, the echo. Because even if Harold went to prison, Grace would still wake up in a world forever altered. And Denise, no matter how hard she fought, would still live with the realization that the unthinkable had happened inside what she called home. And that realization doesn't disappear in court. It follows you. The aftermath didn't arrive like peace. It arrived like silence. A silence that was too heavy to be normal. Because once the case moved into the public machinery, charges, interviews, forensic reports, Denise realized something that no one prepares families for. Even when the predator falls, the damage doesn't. The damage stays in the air. It stays in the body. It stays in the way a mother flinches when she hears footsteps behind her. It stays in the way she can't look at family photographs without wondering what she didn't see in the background. Denise's home was no longer a home in her mind. It was a crime scene she had once decorated. Every room held memory now. Not soft memory, weaponized memory. The hallway where Harold used to stand casually. The bathroom where routines happened. Grace's bedroom door. The computer desk. The couch where Harold sat smiling while hiding everything. Denise didn't just lose a husband. She lost her trust in the concept of ordinary. The most haunting part of long-term trauma is not the violence itself. It's the rewriting of reality. Denise had to accept that her life had contained a second hidden story running underneath it for years. And now that hidden story was exposed, it poisoned everything it touched. Hospital staff continued supporting Grace. Medical care continued. Pregnancy care, counseling, supervision. Everything became controlled, deliberate. But psychological care is harder. Grace had limitations in communication, but trauma doesn't require eloquence. Trauma lives in the nervous system. It lives in the way the body reacts, even when the brain can't fully explain why. Denise saw it in the smallest moments. Grace pulling away from touch. Grace stiffening when a male nurse entered. Grace becoming withdrawn during certain routines. Denise began understanding how much she had once mistaken as her condition was likely something else. Something caused. Something learned. And that understanding created a guilt so corrosive Denise sometimes felt like it was eating her alive. Because mothers measure themselves by protection. And now Denise had to live with the knowledge that she hadn't protected Grace from the one person she had welcomed into their lives as protection. That guilt doesn't vanish when the system arrests someone. It mutates. It becomes a private punishment. Denise couldn't sleep in the same bed without remembering Harold beside her, breathing calmly, while living a secret life. She couldn't listen to quiet house sounds without imagining what might have happened while she was at work. And she began realizing that the echo of abuse is not simply emotional. It's logistical. After Harold, everything changed. If Grace needed care, Denise questioned every provider. If Grace needed assistance, Denise hovered constantly. If a door closed, Denise opened it. The hypervigilance became her new baseline. People around her might have thought she was intense, anxious, paranoid. But Denise wasn't paranoid. Denise had learned the price of trust. The legal process continued. There were interviews. Professionals documented everything. Investigators gathered more evidence. Forensics worked through device data. But the case didn't offer Denise the clean relief she imagined justice might bring. Instead, justice became another trauma. Because to prosecute, the system demanded repetition. Repetition of facts. Repetition of details. Repetition of the nightmare, spoken out loud until words became razor wire. Denise had to retell the story to people who asked questions politely, clinically, as if they were discussing weather. Sometimes those professionals were compassionate. Sometimes they were detached. But detachment can feel cruel when you're living inside the story. And Denise discovered another brutal truth. The system wasn't built for emotional survival. It was built for outcomes. Convictions. Sentences. Procedural closure. But a conviction does not reverse a child's violation. It does not rebuild the years. It does not restore the innocence that was stolen inside the walls of a family home. Even if Harold was convicted, he would still occupy space in Denise's mind, not as a man, but as a permanent scar. Grace's future changed too, not just medically, but socially, because cases like this don't stay private. People talk, people whisper, people speculate, and disabled victims are often treated with a special kind of cruelty. Pity mixed with distance, as if their pain is uncomfortable to witness. Denise had to guard Grace not only from perpetrators, but from the world's gaze, from the way strangers might look at her daughter as a story rather than a person, from the way communities sometimes treat victims as cautionary tales instead of humans. Denise tried to rebuild stability, but stability now meant control. It meant routines so strict nothing could slip. It meant teaching boundaries in ways she wished she had taught earlier. It meant learning to live with the fact that the monster wasn't an outsider. The monster had shared meals. The monster had folded laundry. The monster had smiled in family photos. That knowledge became Denise's permanent haunting. And then, as time passed, a more unsettling question crept into her thoughts. What if this wasn't the first time Harold had done something like this? Investigators might look into that. They might uncover other victims, other patterns. But Denise knew even if they didn't, even if Harold's crimes remained limited to Grace, the possibility itself would linger. Because predators don't usually begin at their worst act. They escalate. They test boundaries. They learn what they can get away with. Harold had learned a lot. And Denise, sitting alone in her house after the courtroom days and the interviews, sometimes wondered, how many people had misread him as helpful? How many people had trusted him? How many small red flags had been dismissed by others, the same way she dismissed them? The echo wasn't just personal. It was communal. It forced Denise to see the world differently, not as safe or unsafe, but as uncertain, as a place where evil doesn't always announce itself, as a place where evil might wear politeness like perfume. Grace survived. That is the one fact Denise held on to when her mind threatened to collapse. But survival is not the same as recovery. Recovery is slow, nonlinear. Sometimes Grace seemed calmer. Sometimes she seemed distant again. Some days she laughed. Some days she stared into space for long stretches. Denise learned to live in those fluctuations, to stop demanding a straight line toward healing, to accept that what happened had changed Grace's internal world permanently. And the darkest part of the echo was not just what Harold did. It was what Harold stole from Denise too, the ability to believe in peace. Because even if the house became quiet again, quiet no longer meant safe. Quiet meant hidden. It meant something could be happening without sound. That's what Harold taught her. And Denise hated him for that lesson more than anything else. Years later, the story would exist online, reduced to headlines, to sensational phrasing, to the kind of titles that pull clicks. But inside Denise's life, it would never feel like content. It would feel like a permanent shift in reality, a line between before and after. And the most disturbing part, the part that refused to settle, was how long it took for anyone to notice. Not because they didn't care, but because the crime was designed to be invisible. A disabled victim, a trusted caretaker, a mother exhausted by survival, a home that looked normal. Everything about it was built for secrecy. And once Denise accepted that, she saw the true horror. Harold didn't just abuse Grace. He abused the structure of their lives. He exploited dependence. He exploited fatigue. He exploited trust. And he exploited the fact that society often overlooks the inner lives of disabled people. That was his advantage. That was his cruelty. That was his unthinkable. In the final quiet of this case, Denise sometimes returned to the moment that began it all. The hospital corridor, the fluorescent lights, the phone in her hand. She remembered how she couldn't breathe, how the world turned sideways, how she realized her life had been split open. And then she would look at Grace, older now, still vulnerable, still her daughter, and feel the lingering question that never fully leaves cases like this. How many other homes look normal right now, while something unthinkable is happening behind closed doors? Because the real ending of stories like this is never a clean sentence. It's not closure. It's awareness. It's the permanent understanding that monsters do not always break in. Sometimes they are invited. Sometimes they offer help. Sometimes they become family. And by the time you realize the truth, the damage has already been living in your house for years. And the only proof that it ever happened is the way silence feels different forever. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's a warning most people don't want to hear. Danger doesn't always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like help. Sometimes it looks like family. And sometimes it lives close enough to you that you stop questioning it until it's too late. So I'll leave you with this. How many people are living inside a nightmare right now with nobody believing them? If this case affected you, share your thoughts in the comments. Not for drama, but because these stories deserve to be remembered for what they really are, evidence of what silence can cost. And if you want more long-form, deeply researched true crime documentaries like this one, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next story is even darker, and it starts with a detail most people overlook.